Number four, I would say communicate your character. People want to know, who exactly are you? What do you bring? What are your values? What's your inner self? What's been your experience? That's number four. And number five, I would add very simply, honor the room. It's a politician's phrase, very applicable at the moment during our campaign for the White House.
Welcome to The Ripple Effect, the podcast that takes you on a journey through the minds of Wharton faculty. I'm your host, Dan Loney, and in each episode, we'll be diving deep into the inspiration behind the groundbreaking research that Wharton professors have conducted and exploring how their findings resonate with the world today.
Well, we know that leadership is an important component of our society, and we expect our government leaders to bring a level of leadership that can lead our cities, our states, our communities, and our country to be the best that it can be. So what are those qualities we expect to see in a president or a senator or other political leader? Pleasure to be joined to discuss this with Mike Useem, who is a professor emeritus of management here at the Wharton School. Mike, always great to talk to you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Dan. Always great to talk with you.
You know, you talked about this several years ago in your book, The Leader's Checklist. What are some of the components that you have found out to be very important that may apply to the political landscape?
So, Dan, I would identify 5 components of a leader's checklist. And just to comment on the checklist concept itself, a mission critical leader's checklist, that's the modifier I tend to use these days, mission critical, will include all the capabilities that are essential for getting the job done. And they're not additive. Each is necessary, if not sufficient. Among the 5 necessary, but not actually fully sufficient, are at the top, at least of my list, see if this sounds right to you, when it comes to politics, political figures, people running companies, those in senior government positions, begin with number 1, thinking strategically. That seems like a good idea. Acting decisively, okay, that's a really good idea, I think, too, thus mission critical. Number 3, communicating persuasively. You're going nowhere with anybody else if you don't bring them on board and get them moving in the right direction with you. That, too, seems essential, but I think I would add 2 more then to round it out at 5. Actually, I tend to go a good bit more than that, but just make it the top 5. Number 4, I would say communicate your character. People want to know, who exactly are you? What do you bring? What are your values? What's your inner self? What's been your experience? That's number 4. And number 5, I would add very simply, honor the room. It's a politician's phrase, very applicable at the moment during our campaign for the White House. But more generally, honoring the room means little more than, it's pretty obvious what it means, I guess. It means a little more than taking a few minutes, can be very brief, to remind those that are on your team or going in the same direction with you, or you'd like to go with you somewhere in common, remind them how good they are and how essential they are to get to the more promised land.
What's interesting about the political landscape right now is that it's so divided. And I think that's a challenge when you're talking about leadership, is there's such division in terms of what people believe, whether, the part, no matter the party that you're talking about. And I think at times, doesn't it seem like that it's that much more of a challenge to be able to deliver the message when you have so very divergent mindsets on so many topics right now?
You're absolutely right, Dan. The challenge is, and this is why we, at least in the private sector, tend to reward people who lead big companies effectively. We tend to pay them a lot of money. Even there, we think of shareholders as the primary stakeholder in a company, but all people in senior corporate positions are concerned about employees, about supply chains, about the community where they operate. And pulling those diverse constituencies together in common cause, common purpose, is a challenge. And almost by definition, it is a challenge that a political candidate has, because given the great diversity in our voting public, Their great challenge is to pull people together who have often I'll just say it again, very diverse points of view. And the art of leadership, in my humble view, is finding the places where people can find common agreement. We couldn't find that back in 1861 when the country fell apart over the Civil War. A little tough this year as well to find that, but I think the great leaders of the moment are those that can find common ground, even if it looks like there is none out there.
So doesn't that put even a greater emphasis on the communication that a political leader brings forward in terms of how they're delivering that message to both sides of the political aisle?
It does indeed, and that is the art of communicating persuasively to people who otherwise are looking, say, to hear a certain message and disregard others. And that is, well, I'll make it kind of a rhetorical question here, Dan. Isn't that what leadership is all about? Nobody has a playing field with a bunch of figures out there that all think like you, and thus all you have to do is snap your fingers and off we go. Whether it's private sector, nonprofit sector, or government or politics, the art of effective and persuasive communication is appreciating that the differences are out there, but finding the common ground therein is indeed what we want in great leaders that we admire.
It does seem, though, that the element of communication is something that maybe our political leaders don't take maybe as much emphasis on in where we are now in compared to what we've seen in years past.
I think I agree with that. I think words count, just to put the same point in a slightly different phrasing. Words really count. Sentences count. Sometimes we say if we just say it, our job is done. But getting those words right, the phrases nuanced and subtle and communicating to diverse constituencies is partly what leadership, whatever the organization or whatever the country may be. And it's a challenge to do that. It's a learned skill set, and we need a lot of that.
Does it put more emphasis on the team that you have assembled to help support you in terms of doing all of the things that you would like to do to improve the country? If you have that right team together, that will hopefully get you to the finish line.
Dan, I could not agree more, or to put it in almost a metaphor here, leadership is an individual and a team sport. You're going to get a long way by exercising your own independent judgment, developing your own strategy, crafting your own words. But at the end of just about everybody's day, your impact also depends on the quality of the team and the capacity of the team members around you. So leadership in that regard is an individual and a team sport.
One of the other challenges right now also seems to be the level of so-called noise that's out there. And a lot of that comes because of the digital component that we have in all of our lives. And obviously we see it play a role in politics as well. Speak to that component, if you can, for a little bit about our leaders being leaders and dealing with all of the noise.
We have to, quote, deal with the noise for sure. But isn't that yet again one more art of what we would say a great leader has to have, which is cutting through the noise to send an actual signal? Signal and noise, sometimes the signal gets lost if the noise is too intense. Finding the right metaphors, the right lines of thinking, the good thoughts that indeed get to people's working consciousness in a way that's compelling is the art of effective and persuasive communication.
What's the secret then to get back to the type of leadership that we all remember when you think about some of the great leaders that we've had in this country?
Dan, I think I go back to where we began, and that is they brought the right character above all to the setting. And character's got many sub-pieces to it. We can talk about that in a bit if you like. So they had character and they communicated it. It's two separate statements there. We want to follow people, whatever the setting, who have authenticity, credibility, integrity, and well beyond. And we don't know about that unless they are very effective at communicating that. So communicating your character above all. And then I think number two, kind of at this, kind of back to the checklist here, the fifth item I had mentioned a few minutes ago is honoring the room. That was the phrase I used. It's a politician's phrase. And because we're asking people for a vote or asking them to work hard if it's a company, or asking them to invest in us if they're an institutional owner, it is helping people to remember that they're part of the story. They're where you're going together, and thus making certain that you honor them in ways that speak to who they are, what they bring to the table, with an authenticity to it is part of the formula. Honor the room.
You mentioned the components of character. What are those in your mind?
Then it usually breaks down into 4 or 5 terrains that we already tend to use as almost a byword, or at least a kind of a capturing phrase for somebody's character. Are they authentic? Which usually connotes, do they have the values that we admire? Do they stay with the values that they have espoused when they do disclose those values? We want people with integrity. What they say is what they mean and what they will do. We want people who are able to absorb and learn about the values and concerns of all the followers that you're responsible for leading. So it's a multifaceted, many-piece object, but I will say I think we know it when we see it.
That element of values and integrity, that's something I think in this landscape becomes even more important, not only for who you are as a politician, but who you are as a human being as well. Basically you're being reviewed not only about your political history, but your history as an individual. You know, if you spent time in the military, or if you were an excellent student, or you were a leader in your community, there are so many elements that really come into play for that.
You're absolutely right. And a different way to put the same point is that in politics and business and the nonprofit world, part of your great challenge in communicating your character is to communicate who are you exactly. And for that, I think there's no better vehicle to carry the story than to tell a story in which you're featured. And here's what I did when I faced a challenge. Here's what I did when I was faced with a takeover. Here's what I did when I had maybe a bad stretch. And the art of storytelling, I think, is an essential quality, absolutely essential quality to communicate your character. That's how we look to learn about it. It's what we remember about a candidate or a politician or a business leader.
In the end, how much do you see correlations between being a leader of a country or a leader of a community in the political landscape to being the leader as a CEO of a company?
Well, let's see. I think they're different, but not different. At root, of course, it's a different landscape. There are different rules to play. But at root, the underlying concepts of leadership and what people look for, I actually think are not all that much different. They look for character. They look for integrity. They look to see, are you a strategic thinker or are you purely tactical? They look to see, do you equivocate or do you make a timely decision? They look to see, are you a persuasive communicator or can you somehow have trouble getting out the ideas? And I think those concepts, strategic thinking, persuasive communication, decisive action, are common to all. They're common across life, whatever it may be.
And I would imagine there's an element of, to a degree, hitting the ground running. If you are somebody who's in politics, you win a race, you get into office, is really kind of go from day one to be able to start to kind of talk about and deliver on the things you talked about during the campaign.
Yeah, a different way to put the same point, my phrasing here is leadership is not for the faint of heart. There's no day that's not hard. You've got the constituencies that disagree. You make mistakes. You're constantly under the scrutiny of your constituents. Even if it's the private sector, everything a chief executive does is observed, recorded, and ends up on the web. So, quick summary on that point. Strong self-confidence moving forward is a platform to get going. It's not what we look for in a candidate or in a company CEO or a CEO successor, but it is part of the storyline, or it's part of the, let's call it the checklist. Going back to that phrase, it should be on the checklist, a determination to get the job, remembering that what you're doing is making a difference, hopefully in a more promising direction than others, of taking people to a more promised land.
Mike, great to talk to you as always. Thanks very much for your time and your insight. All the best.
All right, Dan, thank you. Great to talk as always.
You got it. Mike Useem, who's Emeritus Professor of Management here at the Wharton School.
Thank you for listening to The Ripple Effect. We hope you found this episode informative and engaging. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review so that we can continue to bring you the best insight from the Wharton School.